On today's episode of Locked On Wild, where we at with John Hynes? We in, we out. We'll take a look at the numbers after John Hynes took over and some areas to improve next year on today's episode of Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we'll take a look at the John Hynes tenure and ask the question, are we in? Are we out? We'll take a look at what happened right after he took over and break it down into sections as to the overall picture of the areas the team improved and the areas the team needs to work on heading into next season. My name is Seth Topol, your daily Minnesota Wild insider. Happy to be here for another episode. And we were initially going to talk about some areas in the lineup that need to be plugged, but was on the road for a little bit of the day today. And this popped into my head with the news that Team USA had been eliminated from the World Championships with a 1-0 loss to Czechia. And so they are done with the team with the World Championships, and so this idea popped into my head. All told, after the 5-14 start for the Minnesota Wild, John Hynes took over and led the Minnesota Wild to an overall record of 34-24. And 5. And so from the time he started on November 27th to the time the regular season ended, April 18th, the Wild had the 13th most points in the league with 73, which middle of the pack. Really, 34-29 after a 5-14 start. I mean, it's essentially 500 hockey. The Wilds, under John Hynes, scored 3.05 goals per game. Gave up 2.94 goals per game under John Hynes. The power play was great, 25%, which ranked them in that span, ranked them 8th in the league in power play percentage at 25.1%. That I like. Penalty kill wise, the Wild were 77.3%. So a bump up from dead last under Dean Evason to just 22nd for the league under John Hynes. And so the peripheral numbers improved, but I think the overall picture for this team remains the same. It's an old roster, and it is a roster that is in need of some speed and skill, in addition to also being a tiny roster. That never changed. That didn't change from Dean Evason to John Hynes, and in fact, with the trades that were made at the deadline, those numbers actually got worse. And so this is one of the other things, too, that I keep reminding myself in why John Hynes was brought in after Dean Evason was let go. It was widely reported that Dean Evason, that John Hynes ran a similar system to Dean Evason, and that John Hynes wasn't going to change a ton, wasn't going to rock the boat for this team. He was somebody that was going to be able to come in with the car careening off course and was going to be able to jump in through the window, grab the steering wheel, and get back onto the highway without flipping it. So you're not seeing, we didn't see a ton in the way of drastic changes. We saw some subtle tweaks. We saw emphasis on particular areas that should have been emphasized from the get-go. And there were a lot of areas in which they were similar as well. So it's not as though he came in and he revolutionized Minnesota Wild hockey. Like, he got the players back on track. He got them to focus up because of the shock of firing a coach into a season. The style of play remains the same. The way in which the team wins games remains the same. And so it is interesting to take a look at this tenure and try to kind of dissect it a little bit. Now, one thing that we do need to keep in mind is there was a stretch in which the Wild went, I think it was in the month of January. So let's just take a peek at that. There was a stretch in January in which I believe the Wild were something like 1-7. Yeah, they were 5-8-1 for the month of January, and that was widely due to missing many pieces on the roster. And so if you're able to avoid that stretch in which it started with a loss against Winnipeg on December 30th, and it actually was a stretch in which they went 7-1. Yep, from Winnipeg on December 30th to Arizona on January 13th. The Wild went 1-7-1. So in a 9-game stretch, you win once. If the Wild even get to 4 wins in that stretch, and they go 4-3-1, if they even go 500 in that stretch, then we're talking about a little bit of a different record to where you maybe 38-21-5 or something like that. But the moral of the story here is that John Hynes essentially kept the Dean Evason tenure going. He just had emphasis put in the areas that it should be put, that Dean wasn't emphasizing, which is why we saw some of the success that we did. We'll talk about those areas as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild, as we continue to dive in to the John Hynes tenure. What did we learn from the first part of the equation, and what will this team need to do moving forward? We'll talk about all of that as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Game Time, folks. The Minnesota Timberwolves in action in the Western Conference Finals. It's a hot ticket, but Game Time can help you secure your seats to see the Minnesota Timberwolves play in the Western Conference Finals in Game 2 at the Target Center on Friday. Game Time helps you in a variety of ways. If you are hoping that you can get work off to be able to go to the game and have to wait to the last minute, Game Time can help you. If you are hoping to see what you'll be able to see from your seat in the venue, Game Time can help you. Game Time also can offer you last-minute deals. They have flash deals where you will save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or event. You can also get zone deals where you save even more when you choose a section and let Game Time choose the seats. All of this paired with Game Time's lowest price guarantee. If you find tickets that are cheaper, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So if you're looking to see the T-Pups in action Take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to tune in tomorrow. Isha Jerome of the Soda Pod will join us as we revisit the 2004, 2006, and 2007 drafts to see what the Wild could have done, because I'll give you a hint. The first round picks in those seasons, not great. The drafts in general, not particularly good in those seasons. So we'll take a look at what they could have done had they not taken the likes of A.J. Thielen, Colton Gillies, and James Shepard. That's coming up on tomorrow's show. Let's get back to the task at hand. Evaluating the John Hynes tenure. So let's talk about some of the things that John Hynes did to create different results from basically the same scheme. Number one, John Hynes did away with the overall mentality of the Dean Evason tenure, which was that the Wilds were going to have to be the immovable object to stop the unstoppable force. The Wild did not play with speed, quickness. They played to try to slow down and wear down their opponents with physicality and trying to make life difficult for opposing offenses and opposing teams. But it turns out if you are not fast yourself, it's hard to hit what you can't see. And so John Hynes got rid of that mentality. The Wilds at least got back to a situation where they were trying to exit the zone with quickness, and we're trying to focus on being quick with moving the puck up the ice, being quick with getting the puck out of the offensive zone, and trying to really maximize offensive zone time with the puck. Way too many times, especially early in the season, we saw the Wilds get pinned up in their own ends, pinned up in the defensive zone, and they couldn't get out. John Hynes came in, and that was a point of emphasis to get the team to where if the opponent had the puck on their side of the ice, they were able to get to it and get it back up the ice quickly. So just a subtle tweak that paid big dividends for the Minnesota Wild throughout the rest of the season. Number two is prioritizing the key players. How many times, raise your hands, did we see Dean Evason deploy Freddie Gaudreau in a key situation over the last couple of seasons? Too many to count. John Hynes replaced, as his center of choice, Freddie Gaudreau with Joel Eriksson Ek. Now that seems like a no-brainer, but Dean Evason didn't really do it. John Hynes, when he needed a face-off win, he went and got the center that was going to be able to bring him a face-off win. When he needed key players on the ice in particular situations, they were on the ice. When he felt a line combination wasn't doing what they needed to do, he put the players on the ice that needed to be there. He was not afraid to make changes in game. He was not afraid to double shift Kirill Kaprizov with the fourth line, double shift them with the third line, double shift them with the second line. He was not afraid to put mileage on the tires of his best players. Now, all of these things are not like revolutionary coaching ideas, but Dean Evason didn't do them. Dean didn't make line changes unless an absolute act of Congress was passed to demand that he did so. John Hynes, if he saw that particular players were playing, Now, there are exceptions. There are exceptions that have been brought up. I'm not blind to what happened with Marcus Johansson throughout the season, but I have a theory on that. By and large, John Hynes was not opposed to making changes during the game if he wanted a particular look. If he wanted, after a penalty kill, Kirill Kaprizov and Matt Boldy and Joel Eriksson Ek to play together, he did it. He eventually brought those three together as a top line. Something that Dean Evason tried a couple of times, but really not at all. And look at the success that they had down the stretch. Now, large part of that was Kirill Kaprizov being on like a surface of the sun level heater, but still, it was a line combination that produced a ton of points and wasn't really primarily utilized under Dean Evason. So willingness to, and the other thing we got to talk about, and I know it led to the team being burned on the day that he eventually knocked them out of the postseason. But don't even try to tell me that Dean Evason would have pulled his goalie in overtime. There is zero chance that Dean Evason would have done that. And so John Hynes needs to be given some props for that, for being willing to lay it all out there when the team was in the fight of their lives for a playoff spot that you can argue they maybe shouldn't have been trying to get. But regardless, John Hynes laid all his chips out there, and that is something that I'm not going to erase when considering whether or not he is the guy going forward. Now, do I think he's the guy that will ultimately bring this team to a title? Probably not. But that's not to say that he's not capable of getting things out of this team with the roster that he has at his disposal. Because that's the other piece of the puzzle here, is the roster that he has at his disposal. That's not a roster that he sets. That's a roster that is put together by the GM. We'll talk about that coming up, but some of these other areas in which John Hynes needs to be given some credit is adjustments in game, getting the team back on track and focusing more on playing just an up-to-date style. They still are a team that has a lot of warts on the roster. That's not something that can be fixed. Players aren't magically going to get faster. But going from trying to be like one of the few teams in the league that tries to slow teams down to understanding that that's a real tough task and that you have to have modern elements to your game. That's an adjustment in and of itself. And so these are all things that a new set of eyes can bring to your organization. And these are things that John Hynes did bring to the Minnesota Wild. But there are areas that still need a lot of work. And so we'll finish by talking about the areas for improvement, and we will issue a final edict as to whether or not John Hynes is the guy as we finish today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Indeed. Folks, there is no I in team, but there is one in Indeed, and that is the hiring platform you need to build yours. When you're hiring, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Instead of spending hours on multiple job sites searching for candidates with the right skills, Indeed's a powerful hiring platform that can help you do it all. Indeed is an unbelievably powerful hiring platform, delivering 4 times more hires than all other job sites combined, according to Talent Nest 2019. Join more than 3 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Best part that I love about Indeed as somebody looking for a job at the moment is that Indeed will tell you if your resume is missing qualifications a particular job is asking for, and will give you the opportunity to elaborate or to see if you can match up with what a particular job is looking for. Start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/lockedon. Offer good for a limited time. Claim your $75 credit now at Indeed.com/lockedon. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to check in tomorrow as we've got Isha Jerome of the Soda Pod joining us to revisit the 2004, 2006, and 2007 Minnesota Wild drafts. I'll give you a hint. Not pretty. We'll talk about that coming up tomorrow. It's time for me to get out my tinfoil hat because I've talked about this conspiracy for a while, and we're gonna fully flesh it out because I think talked myself into believing it, and it was pointed out by Denny in the YouTube comments when talking about John Hynes is this notion of John Hynes stacking the deck on the top line to show the weaknesses of the rest of the roster. It was an article written by Hockey Wilderness. I think Justin Hine was the author. We talked about this a few weeks ago, meant to get to it. Life got in the way. But this notion that Hines puts Matt Boldy, Joel Eriksson Ek, and Kirill Kaprizov on the top line and kept them there for the most part so that Bill Guerin would get an opportunity on a nightly basis to see just how many holes exist on this roster night in, night out, and how glaring having even one player on that second line that's not producing can be. And Denny's response to that was, that's all well and good, but it doesn't explain why Marcus Johansson played as many games as he did on the second line and why he continued to be put there even though he had 43 games last season with one or fewer shots. 43 games out of a possible, I think he played around 70. And that's a very fair point. That is a very fair point. And honestly, it's one that does put a little bit of a hole in the stacking the top of the deck notion. But I'll piggyback off of that because there is a scenario in which Marcus Johansson being on line number 2 was not a call that John Hynes made. That was a roster decision that was not made by the head coach, but was made by the general manager so as to try to give him an opportunity to show that he had a little something, to maybe up his trade value in the offseason and to allow the Wild an opportunity to go to Marcus Johansson and say, look, it's not working here. Let's get you to a better spot to have an opportunity to play on a team that's maybe closer to the postseason than the Wild are. Because it comes down to contributing on a nightly basis, and it comes down to, making an impact. And I'm sorry, but going through as many games as Marcus Johansson did without having really anything to contribute other than skating up and down the ice, that is just so contrary to the mentality that this team had all the way through the second half of the season, that they were good enough to win and get to the postseason. Making a decision like that, where you put a player in that spot in the lineup and you basically lock them in, just means that you are not being genuine and honest with the fans in saying that you are putting yourself in a position to compete for a playoff spot. Because that second line falling off the scoring like they did was one of the biggest reasons that the Wild missed out on the postseason. It's because they just couldn't get anybody else consistently to score other than Kirill, Kaprizov, Matt Boldy, and Joel Eriksson Ek. That was one of the sole reasons. And so you would think if this team was legitimately trying to put themselves in position for a playoff spot, that they would have said, we have to have a second line that can do something. And so this is one of the big rubs. This is one of the big negative spots in evaluating the early part of the John Hynes tenure, is that the team went basically the whole season with just leaving that spot blank, leaving that as the free space on the bingo card. That it didn't matter if you got nothing. It didn't matter if you got 1 or 2 goals. That spot wasn't changing. Had this team tried a couple of other players in that spot and given them the opportunity to maybe step in and take it, something that was a key point in the end of season press conference. It was a key point in the end of the year review that next season, if the young players are ready to take over spots, that the veterans on the roster better be scared, because there's not going to be anything holding them back from taking them. Now, maybe that was a direct reaction to what we saw from Marcus Johansson for the entire season, but this is what I'm talking about. Like, this is something that Dean was criticized for often during his tenure, is that he would rely almost to a fault on veteran players over youngsters because of the fear of the youngsters making mistakes that impacted wins and losses. When in reality, the youngsters probably helped factor into wins more than the veterans. And this is something that we saw quite often from John Hynes down the line. You get Liam Öhgren into the equation. Okay, third line. You get Marat Huzna, and I understand the Marat Huzna-Dinov third line situation more than I do Liam Öhgren, because Marat Huzna-Dinov and Marco Rossi are both centers, and Rossi did nothing to warrant being demoted in the lineup. So I get that. I get that one. But Liam Öhgren certainly could have garnered more opportunity on the second line. There are plenty of other players, not just Liam Öhgren, that could have benefited from some time on the second line, because they probably would have given you at least something. That's the overall arcing thing here. That's the overall arcing thought, is that we don't know how those guys could have done in that spot, but it would be pretty hard for them to fall short of what that spot produced, which was 11 goals, I think 19 assists, 30 points in 70 games, but also 43 games of one shot or fewer. That's a very small bar to set. And honestly, if you could have gotten even 20 goals from that spot in the lineup, you're probably in the postseason. You were that desperate for a second line that could play Robin to the first line's Batman, and it never materialized. So with John Hynes, that was one of the rubs. Now, The evaluation portion continues here this year, obviously. And so that is a point that can be changed. But this is the thing with these coaches that have been there and have not won. Now, is it fair to base all of a coach's history? Is it fair to kind of take that and transfer it to a different tenure? Maybe not, but it's the same thing at both New Jersey and Nashville, was a reliance on veterans. That's not a Minnesota Wild specific theme, but that is something that a lot of coaches kind of default to. So how that changes in year 2 will be critical to not only this team's success, but to the future of the superstar, to the future of Kirill Kaprizov and whether or not he elects to stick around. Clock is ticking. And so is John Hynes the right guy to lead this team into a postseason series, into a deep run towards a Stanley Cup? I'm in the no column as of right now, but as has been the case for many things since I took over as host of Locked On Wild, I am more than willing to be proven wrong. And if I am proven wrong, there is a pile of crow sitting on my desk that I am ready to eat if I'm proven wrong in these instances. So big year for John Hynes on the evaluation side. This is now his team. He gets the opportunity to dictate what this team does through the offseason, into training camp, into the regular season. So there is, much like with Bill Guerin, there is really no excuse for John Hynes this year other than what we've known for a long time. It's his team. He had the full offseason to get everything ready. And you can't hide behind, well, I came in midway through the year and it was a lost season anyway. So going to be very interested to see what happens with the John Hynes tenure here in year 2. And you can bet that we will have you covered every step of the way. That will do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Appreciate everybody's support here over the last couple of days and appreciate your support to Locked On Wild as well. Make sure to tune in on your favorite audio platforms, YouTube, wherever you listen. We thank you, and make sure to leave us a like or a review to help get the reach out a little further to other Wild fans. You can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.